Welcome to the Witness History Podcast from the BBC World Service. Today we're taking you back to April 1986, when Pope John Paul II made a historic journey to a synagogue in Rome. He hoped to heal the wounds inflicted by centuries of division between Jews and Catholics. In 2014, Alan Johnston spoke to Professor Giacomo Saban, a Jewish community leader who met with the Pope.
Italian state television is covering an event at Rome's main synagogue. A black limousine sweeps up to its entrance and the Polish Pope, John Paul II, emerges. In his white robes, he waves at the crowd. John Paul's come from the Vatican, which lies just across the river Tiber, but it's taken centuries to make this short journey. In 2,000 years of Catholic history, there's no record of a pope having ever entered a synagogue. It seems that John Paul will be the first. The synagogue is in what used to be Rome's Jewish ghetto, where thousands once lived severely restricted, humiliating lives. A former leader of the community, Professor Giacomo Saban, recalls the Latin words of the 16th century papal decree that ordered the establishment of the ghetto.
Cum nimis absurdum. Is it not ridiculous? Is it not ridiculous that the Jews should live amongst us in peace after they have crucified Jesus? And the Jews were closed up in this region.
In the ghetto.
The ghetto. They had to pay for the expense of erecting walls also.
And behind those walls there were very strict limits on how Rome's Jews could make a living. They were largely restricted to money-lending activities and trading in second-hand goods. Many endured extreme poverty.
It was all a complex of laws and bylaws which aimed at diminishing the prestige and making the Jews feel second-rate citizens with no value at all.
In the squalor of their overcrowded alleyways, they were subjected to intense pressure to convert to Christianity. They were regularly forced to attend anti-Semitic sermons delivered by Catholic priests. The ghetto conditions ended in 1870, but memories of that long period of oppression meant not all Rome's Jews welcomed the idea of the Pope visiting their synagogue.
There were a lot of people who said no. Lots of people who said, this is going to be something terrible because priests never came to the ghetto except to persecute us. I remember talking with friends, and one of them said, look, I remember my grandmother, when she saw a priest in the street, she was to pass to the other side of the road because she was just physically afraid. She had grown up in the last years of the ghetto, and seeing a priest was a menace.
But it was eventually decided that the visit should go ahead. And so on that day in the spring of 1986, John Paul II walked into the synagogue. As the choir welcomed him, the smiling Pope strode slowly down the central aisle. The Roman Jews who crowded into the great marble hall knew that their neighbour from the Vatican wasn't only reaching out to them. He was making a gesture of reconciliation to Jews all around the world. On a stage, surrounded by rabbis, the Pope sat down to listen to his hosts. Professor Saban spoke first, telling the story of all that his community had experienced during its long history in Rome, the good, the bad, and the very bad.
While I was talking, I looked in front of me, and just sitting not very far from where you are, there was a person who at the time was the Minister of the Interior and later would be one of the presidents of the Italian Republic. And he was listening to me. He was a devout Catholic, with a smile, because I kept saying a lot of things which for a Catholic must have sounded terrible.
Professor Saban talked of the suffering that Catholics, within sight of the Vatican, had inflicted on Rome's Jews during the time of the ghetto. But his references were not all to past centuries. He spoke also of what happened in World War II.
When, in October 1943, the SS surrounded the ghetto and started going from house to house at 5 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, collecting Jews, the Vatican didn't say anything. And that was something which the Jews have not forgotten.
Hundreds of Rome's Jews were murdered at Auschwitz. Survivors of the Holocaust were among the crowd in the synagogue that day, and a song that their people sang in the death camps was sung again for the Pope. Eventually, John Paul delivered his message to the Jewish world. In the course of his speech, he emphatically rejected the old Christian idea that Jews could be held collectively responsible for the death of Christ.
Sì, ancora una volta per mezzo mio.
Yes, once again, through myself, the Church deplores the hatred, persecutions, and displays of anti-Semitism directed against the Jews at any time, and by anyone. I repeat, by anyone.
Abbiamo quindi verso di essa
With Judaism, we have a relationship which we do not have with any other religion. You are our dearly beloved brothers, and in a certain way, it could be said that you are our elder brothers.
Rome's chief rabbi called the encounter in the synagogue an historic moment in relations between the two faiths, and Professor Saban agrees.
I had reactions from all over the world, and I remember a cousin of mine who lived in Argentine, who wrote me immediately, we all watched this on the television and it was so extraordinary and everybody was so enthusiastic and so on. So I mean, even in Argentine there were people who were interested, a Catholic country fundamentally, and it made a deep impression.
There was a sense in that room at that moment of two very ancient, important worlds coming together and talking to one another.
Yes, this involved the whole of the Western world. So it was certainly a historical moment, there's no doubt about it.
As the event drew to a close, Professor Saban led the Pope out into the synagogue's garden. They paused before a plaque that commemorated the dead of the Holocaust, and for a moment, standing beneath an umbrella in the Roman rain, the two men reflected on the tragic past.
Professor Giacomo Saban was talking to Alan Johnston for that edition of the Witness History Podcast.